I'm Douglas Murray. This is Direct Address. In recent weeks I've been travelling in Ukraine, among other places, but I wanted to talk today about a story which I think has had far too little attention, but which has been much on my mind. That is the situation of the persecuted Christian churches, particularly in the Middle East and in Africa. In recent weeks, in one incident alone in Congo, 70 Christians were abducted and beheaded by Islamist militia. That's just on one occasion. In more recent days, in Syria, the ancient Christian churches of that country have once again been under attack. It turns out that the Islamists who now run Syria aren't that great or greatly concerned about protecting Christian minorities, and who could have seen that coming? But the real question about all this, which I hear from many people, including many readers, is why is there so little attention to this? Why is there so little news or reaction to atrocities like those I just described? And it's a good question, but it's one to which I think there is a rather obvious answer. You might not have noticed, but there actually isn't an Archbishop of Canterbury at the moment. It's quite an easy thing not to notice that. But if you do go to the ongoing social media threads of Lambeth Palace and so on, you'll find the usual pabulum. You'll find a lot of interfaith stuff. You'll find a bit of green stuff thrown in, of course. But next to nothing about the persecuted Christians of Syria, of Congo, and elsewhere. It's a very strange thing to my mind. It's an odd thing to skip. There is a pope at the moment. He's not well and could be forgiven for not being more outspoken, perhaps for the time being, but it's still rather striking to me that the Roman Catholic Church also remains relatively silent about the killing and persecution of members of its own faith community. People say, well, how could this be? And I think in actual fact there's a very straightforward reason, which is worth lingering on. That's that they're scared. They're very scared. And arguably they have some right to be. The Christian church has a long memory, but you don't have to have an especially long memory to go back to 2006. That's when the then Pope, Benedict XVI, gave his famous Regensburg address. That address was a remarkable piece of work. Benedict, among other things, talked about the intersection of faith and reason. He talked about many things of great depth, but in the course of his remarks, he just quoted, a 14th century Byzantine emperor who said something disobliging about the way in which Islam had been spread as a religion from the beginning, noting, by the way, that Islam had very often been spread by the sword. Pope Benedict made it clear that he wasn't in any way endorsing the comments that he was quoting, but the reaction suggested that, in fact, the quotation from the 14th century Byzantine emperor wasn't that far off. As usual, it seemed that people around the world who were offended by the Pope citing this Byzantine emperor were doing that usual thing of saying, you've got to say my religion is peaceful, otherwise I might kill you. And indeed, there were attacks on Christians in the wake of the Regensburg address around the world. In the West Bank and in Gaza, Palestinian Muslims attacked Christian churches. In Iraq, Assyrian Christians were also attacked and kidnapped and killed. And in Somalia, a 65-year-old Italian nun was killed by some brave jihadists who, again, were trying very hard to prove the peacefulness of their particular faith. In the wake of that response, that violent response to the Regensburg address, Pope Benedict, and indeed most of the Western churches, decided not to tread into this terrain again. And it's something which, in some ways, you couldn't blame them for. The Pope's own Foreign Office advisors seem to have told him that if he wanted to make sure that no 65-year-old Italian nuns were going to get killed again, then he ought to perhaps not be quoting anything about Islam. But still, the silence from so many leaders of the Western churches about the situation of Christians in the persecuted churches is a subject which is deeply, deeply troubling. It's something I've written about before and researched quite a bit. Some 8 years ago or so, I was in northern Nigeria speaking to the persecuted churches there. These are Christian communities of considerable faith who are daily being persecuted by Islamist militia, groups that, among other things, want to bring a caliphate across Africa. It's remarkable hearing their stories firsthand. These are communities who regularly get bombed out in their churches, hunted down in fields, shot, macheted, and much more. I was very moved when I was with those communities to hear them praying the Lord's Prayer and hearing the fervour and the reality that they brought to the line of the Lord's Prayer, "Deliver us from evil." They really knew whereof they spoke. 10 years ago, I reported on the plight of Iraqi and Syrian Christians who were being persecuted by ISIS that was then in the ascendancy. I remember speaking to one woman from the area who had managed to escape to the West, and she said to me that she thought the only way that the Christian churches could survive would be for them to move from Iraq and Syria and gain sanctuary in the West. I remember saying to her, "Don't you think that's going to speed up the process of the end of these churches?" And she looked me in the eye and said to me, "It's the end anyway." That's always stuck with me because, of course, if it was the case that the ancient churches of Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere were chased out, then you have to ask where they'd be chased out from next and what would happen to the countries that they left behind. But the real question comes back to that one, why is there so little attention to this? The answer is, it's a very strange position to expect people to speak up for you and your community more than you're willing to speak up for yourselves. And so long as Christian leaders in the West ignore the plight of their own churches, as long as Christian leaders in the West remain so silent when Christians are being chased out of countries, massacred, beheaded, butchered in their places of worship, it'll be the case that many people around the world will continue to say, well, if the church doesn't speak up for its own, why should we speak up for it? So it doesn't solve the problem, but it would begin to solve the problem if the heads of the churches in the West remembered their persecuted brethren and actually said something on their behalf and for them.